Chapter 57. You sure you know this place, honeybee? Miss Priscilla came up behind me and put a hand on my shoulder. I could barely breathe. I sure couldn't talk. Uncle Alvin answered for me. She knows it. Pete's granddaddy built that shop square and true. I wasn't expecting the feelings that had took over my whole entire body just from seeing a familiar sight that wasn't nothing familiar no more. Do you think Mr. Pete might know where Daddy and Georgie? My blurry eyes searched the sad, caring faces of Matthew and Priscilla, and Uncle Alvin big gator tears rolled down my cheek. Georgie didn't know how to swim. Uncle Alvin reached out to me with a shaky hand. I stared into his black, watery eyes. We're all storm-tossed children now. Ain't nothing we can do about that. A tear fell from his eye. I gotta go find my girl. He nodded at me and walked past the SUV and kept going down on the road. Alvin, Miss Priscilla howled after him. I'm coming with you, darling. Just hang on. She looked from me to Matthew with all the love and a mama can when she looks at her children. Now y'all listen to me. I'm going with Alvin. I don't think he should be by himself in the state he's in. She turned and looked at him getting farther away. She talked faster. I'm gonna get in my truck and take him where he needs to be. Then we're coming right back here. Miss Priscilla looked at her watch. It's 1:45. I'll be back as fast as I can. Don't y'all go nowhere else. I ain't in the mood for no shenanigans. She pointed out her finger for Matthew. Do y'all hear me? Yes, ma'am, we both said. You can wait for me on that bench over there if y'all want. She pointed at the bright white bench sitting up by a door next to Pete's. I know I'd never seen that there before. It tried to look extra bright and white up next to the faded water-stained building. Y'all best not move an inch from this location. She squeezed us in one lump of a hug. Then she walked backward to her truck, still pointing that finger at the two of us. I'm just so proud of the two of y'all, honeybee. You're stronger than you know, darling. Don't you forget that. I won't, I said more to myself than her. I hope she'd hurry back. We can do this, Armani. We'll do it together. Matthew let out a poof of air that blew into his bangs out of his eyes. We'd been standing there in the same spot for at least 5 minutes. I wanted to find out if Mr. Pete knew anything, but I didn't want to know it all at the same time. Thanks, Matthew. I don't think I could go in there without you. I held onto the lock and stared at the knob of the half-red door with the water line almost to the top. I knew it was time. A little flutter started in the bottom of my belly. I closed my eyes, imagined the smells that we were always waiting for on the other side of that door. The thought of warm donuts spread through me. I was ready to cross the road. I took hold of Matthew Bowman's hand, hugged my brother's glasses to my heart, and headed for the door. I stopped walking. Matthew stopped too. I never felt that feeling of hope so strong and real in my whole entire life. Then familiar no one else but swept me off my shaky feet. A smile took hold on my face. What? Matthew said, staring at me all crazy. A giggle slipped past my lips. A little bounce on my feet. That bench, it's our porch swing, me and Mima's. Well, really, it's my mama's, but whatever. It's our swing. I know it is. If the swing was there, then Daddy has to be too. You sure? It looks new. I let loose of Matthew's hand. I stepped up to the chair that my papa had built with his own two hands. My finger found one of the groups I've been chasing my whole life. The porch swing was painted new and white, but the names were still there, just like always. The storm couldn't take them names away. Daddy finally painted it. The world came out in a choked up cry. I squeezed my eyes shut. My insides felt torn in half. I didn't know I could be so happy and sad at the same time. The feeling of a person not being there is way stronger than when a person is there. I knew Daddy would be waiting for me up inside that shop, but seeing the pretty white swing reminded me that I'd never get to sit on it again with me, Mom. Never. You ready to go inside? Matthew whispered. I wiped my nose across my top of my sleeve, forgetting altogether that it wasn't polite, especially in front of a boy. I took hold of Matthew's hand again and forced a smile the best that I could. I turned to the rough, rusty doorknob and it never felt scratchy like that before. The door creaked open like there was sand in the hinges. I pushed a little harder on it and reminded myself to breathe.
Chapter 58. Hello? I whispered. My heart raced almost as fast as my brain. The door finally swung all the way open with a stale whoosh. Not the happy ding of the bell like always. I right away knew it wasn't the smell of donuts burning my nose. I stood where I was, afraid to take one step into the gutted out looking inside of what was supposed to be Mr. Pete's donut shop. I found the urge to run outside and check to make sure maybe it wasn't the right building. My lips started to tremble and the tears were coming on. There was no way Daddy or anybody else could be inside that place. There was no lights on, but I couldn't still tell that the orangey colored floor tile was gone. There was nothing there but cold-looking concrete. The sound of loud clunking fans filled the air, and the smell. The smell was so strong I could taste it. A mix of old rain, bleach, mothballs, and canal. Stinking canal. Nobody's here. No sooner did I get the words out of my mouth when a man's voice from somewhere inside the shop hollered out, "Hello? Is someone there?" I knew that voice. Matthew real quick hollered back, "Yes, sir. Can we come in?" "Of course you can, son. What can I do for you?" We stepped inside the shop. After blinking a few times, I could see that it wasn't as dark and awful as it looked when I peered it from outside, but it was still bad. The glass came from where Mr. Pete showed off outside, but it still was bad. The glass case where Mr. Pete showed off the fresh donuts was broke to pieces. A big old pile of glass was the fresh donuts. The big pile of glass and trash had been swept off to one side. A huge metal table was set up in the middle of the room with tools and cleaners and rags scattered on it. Two big fans blew at the wet-looking walls. Mr. Pete popped out from back where the donut fryers did their donut making. His hands were covered in long yellow plastic gloves. He looked at me and smiled big. It was clear as could be that he was happy to see me. I was bursting from the excitement I was feeling from seeing him. I ran across the dusty concrete and wrapped my arms around his duff belly. Mr. Pete, I'm so happy to see you. I wouldn't be surprised if I'd left squeeze marks on the poor man. I hugged him so tight, I pulled back and pointed at Matthew. This is my friend Matthew Boatman. I was smiling so fierce it was beginning to hurt my jaw. Matthew and Mr. Pete shook hands. It's nice to meet you, son. Mr. Pete nodded at Matthew. Are you serious? You've never been in here to buy donuts? I was wide open nervous rambling at this point. Well, you don't know what you've been missing, right, Mr. Pete? I smiled all big and bounced at a couple times on my feet. I didn't like the way Mr. Pete was looking at Matthew, fidgety and uneasy like. Hey now, another man's voice came from behind us. Is that you, Armani Curtis? I whipped around, and there was old Mr. Lorry holding a push broom. Mr. Lorry! I didn't even really know that old man, but I knew he was Mr. Pete's helper, and I knew that he was Daddy's friend. I went and hugged him like he was kin. I was feeling giggly and jittering the way I feel right before a surprise. I don't know what we would have done if I hadn't spotted old Mr. Frank's bus and recognized your poor messed up bell, Mr. Pete. But it doesn't matter now. The important thing is we're here. I sure wish Mr. Pete would have looked as excited as I felt. I figured maybe he was more quiet with his feelings on account of him living by himself for so long and making donuts all day. Armani, Matthew said, can you come here? He motioned with his head for me to come by him. He glanced up at Mr. Pete, and Mr. Pete looked down at the floor. I stood next to Matthew, he still just as smiling, anticipating the sure surprise I prayed was coming. Lorry, Mr. Pete said. The older man went to him. Mr. Pete whispered something in his ear. Mr. Lorry looked at me. His head went to hanging as he headed for the red door in the corner. The red door that went up to Mr. Pete's living area. The water line was clear up at the top, just like the water line on the outside of the building. A shiver ran through me. Footsteps ran across the floor to Mr. Pete's upstairs. It sure did sound like happy feet causing the ceiling to thump. I looked at Miss Matthew and smiled, but then I froze. All the good I was feeling drained away. In that one tiny second, I noticed the way Matthew and Mr. Pete were looking at each other. It felt like someone reached in and squeezed my heart with both hands. I stared at the closed red door in the corner and forced myself to keep breathing. The whirly hum of the fans were louder and louder. Come on, Daddy, come on. Please, Daddy, open the door. Footsteps pounding down the stairs filled my head. A loud thud bounced off the other side of the door. The door swung open, and Georgie spilled out of the room.
Chapter 59. Georgie, I ran to my brother and fell into him. We stood there hugging and squeezing each other for the longest time. I knew you'd come, Georgie said, not even bothering to wipe the wet mess from his face. If there were ever a time when I loved my brother more, I don't know when it would have been. I wiped his glasses the best I could with the bottom of my shirt and then opened them up and sent them onto his face. He right away took his finger and pushed them up on his nose. Instead of smiling his goofy smile, his eyes fell to the floor. I'm on it, Georgie said. There's something. He didn't get to finish his sentence. Then I just looked over and I seen Tay-Tay standing in the doorway to the stairs, looking more beautiful than ever. I ran across the dirty, sticky floor, crying happy tears the whole time. Her hands rubbed my head. She kissed me while she did her own crying. I'm so sorry, Armani, she said through her tears. You don't have to be sorry, I said to her neck. You're safe. You're alive. Oh no. I pulled my head off her and wiped my face with the back of my hand. Your dad's looking for you. We gotta tell him you're here. Maybe Matthew can go find him. I turned to look at Matthew, but he had his head back to me. But he had his back to me. Him and Georgie and Mr. Pete were all huddled up, talking whispers. Tay took both my hands in hers. She looked straight on with heavy eyes and tilted over her head. I slowly shook my head in the eyes of leaving hers. We stayed into each other for a good while, in an only way that real friends know how. She told me the truth without ever saying one word out loud. New tears filled my eyes but didn't fall. Over her shoulder, I stared at the blurry, empty doorway leading to the upstairs. It stayed empty. I looked back at Tay Tay and all the tears no one spilled from my eyes. Daddy, I barely whispered. Georgie's arm wrapped around me, catching my fall. No, I moaned. All of my feelings turned to dark concrete, crushing me from the inside out. Shattering my heart into a trillion pieces, I let myself be in her arms. Then I closed my eyes and waited for Angel to come show me the way.
Chapter 60. We sat on the porch swing, the four of us, me and Georgie and Tay-Tay and Matthew. None of us saying a word, swinging and waiting for Miss Priscilla to come pick us up in the SUV. Georgie was the one who painted the swing. He said he did it to surprise Mama after him and Mr. Pete found it almost a mile away from where our house had been. I sat there in my usual spot with my back pressed up against my own name and let the sadness settle in. Even with everything that was lost and different, I knew I was home. The storm had come and turned everything I cared about upside down and inside out. Daddy was gone. Mima was gone. Nothing would ever be the same, but I was home. I never did hear the truck pull up. All I seen was Uncle Alvin standing there with a look of thankful spread across his face. Tay-Tay ran to him and wrapped his arms around him. My own arms ached and the feeling of empty took hold of my chest. Miss Priscilla stayed over by her open truck door with a hand pressed up on her by her heart. She looked at me only for a second before she dropped her head. That's when I felt Matthew get up, leaving me and Georgie to ourselves on Mima's swing. I rested my head on Georgie's shoulder and ran my fingers in the carved out first letter of my dead uncle's name. I wondered if he was the uncle who needed to be saved in that day in the canal, or if he was the one who died trying to save someone he loved. I never got to tell Daddy I was sorry. I blinked tears from my eyes and tried to take a normal breath. It's okay, Georgie whispered. No, it's not. My voice was slow and groggy. I need to tell him that I'm sorry and that I love him. Daddy knows, Armani. I know that for sure. Daddy knows. The swing looked different, all white and bright. But when I closed my eyes, putting focus on my ears, and my heart hold the swings felt and sounded the name. You'll always be my little girl, Armani. Now ain't that nice? Daddy and Mima were sitting right there beside me. I could feel them. I kept my eyes closed tight and let my head tilt up towards heaven. I wrapped my foot around my brother's and gave a push on the concrete and took in the music of the swing. High squeak,